Look at what Ukraine's defense ministry announced on Tuesday, April 28, 2026. Ukrainian forces have more than doubled the range of their deep strike capabilities since Russia's February 2022 invasion, from 630 kilometers then to 1,750 kilometers now. Source: Ukraine Defense Ministry official statement, Ukrinform, April the 28th, 2026. 1,750 kilometers. That is the distance from Ukraine's border to the Okhta oil refinery in Russia's Komi Republic, which Ukrainian drones struck on February 2026. That is the distance that gives Ukraine the ability to hit targets deeper inside Russia than Moscow is from Kyiv. That is the range that transforms Ukraine from a defensive force holding territory to an offensive power capable of striking Russian military-industrial infrastructure, energy facilities, and command centers from Crimea to the Arctic Circle. And that range, achieved through 4 years of domestic drone development under wartime conditions, is the strategic shift that is currently putting more pressure on Putin's occupation of Crimea than at any point since 2014. The numbers tell the story. On March 16, 2026, Ukraine's Magyar's Birds unit struck a Russian Anebo 55 ZH-6 radar stations in occupied Crimea. On March 14th, Ukrainian forces destroyed Russian Iskander missile launchers near the villages of Vaishneva and Kurortne in Crimea. On March 15th, an S-400 Triumph air defense system was hit, along with 5 9N6E Protivnik and 7 3E6 Parol radar stations. Source: Mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, March 16th, 2026. That is 3 consecutive days of strikes targeting the most advanced Russian air defense systems protecting the peninsula Putin calls unsinkable. And those strikes are not isolated incidents. They are part of a sustained campaign that has systematically degraded Russia's military capability in Crimea to the point where the Black Sea Fleet, once the backbone of Russian naval power projection in the Mediterranean, has been forced to relocate most of its operational vessels from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk on Russia's mainland coast. Source: Euromaidan Press, April 26, 2026. The question is not whether Ukraine is striking back. The question is whether the pressure Ukraine is applying to Crimea, combined with the strategic overstretch that Russia's simultaneous commitments in Ukraine, the Middle East, and its shrinking global client network have created, is forcing Putin into a calculation he has avoided for 12 years. Can Russia hold Crimea indefinitely while Ukraine possesses the capability to make the peninsula's military installations, energy infrastructure, and logistics networks operationally unusable? The data says no. And the timeline of Ukraine's expanding strike capability, the geographic reach that capability now covers, and the specific targets Ukraine is hitting inside Crimea and across Russia's rear areas, is the evidence that Putin's grip on the peninsula is weaker in April 2026 than it has been at any point since the annexation. The transformation in Ukraine's strike capability happened incrementally, system by system, through domestic defense industrial mobilization that accelerated under pressure of Russian bombardment and uncertain Western supply. In February 2022, Ukraine's longest-range ground launch system was the Soviet-era Toshka-U ballistic missile, with a maximum range of 120 kilometers. Source: open-source defense assessments. That could not hit air bases in Crimea, ammunition depots, or rail hubs deep in Russian territory. Western-supplied ATACMS missiles, delivered in stages starting in 2023, extended Ukraine's reach to approximately 165 kilometers for cluster arm variants and up to 300 kilometers for modern unitary warhead models. Source: Army Recognition. December 10th, 2025. That was enough to hit Crimea's northern logistics nodes, but not enough to reach Sevastopol's naval base on the southern tip of the peninsula, 700 kilometers from Ukraine's pre-war border. The strategic breakthrough came with Ukraine's domestically developed long-range drones. The Neptune cruise missile, originally designed as an anti-ship weapon, was adapted for land attack missions and demonstrated strikes at up to 1,000 kilometers. Source: open source military. Analysis. The Flamingo missile, still in limited deployment, reportedly approaches 3,000 kilometers with smaller payloads. And the mass-produced strike drones that now form the backbone of Ukraine's deep strike campaign, systems like the ones that hit the Okhta refinery in February, can reach targets 1,750 kilometers from the border. Source: Ukraine Defense Ministry, Ukrinform. That progression, from 120 kilometers in 2022 to 1,750 kilometers in 2026, is a 2.8 times increase in operational range, and it is that increase, achieved without waiting for Western permission or Western supply chains, that has made Crimea operationally vulnerable in a way it was not during the first 2 years of the war. The Institute for the Study of War documented the effect of this capability expansion in its April 26th assessment. Ukrainian forces have been steadily increasing the range, volume, and intensity of their long-range strike campaigns against Russian oil infrastructure and military assets in Russia and occupied territories since March 2026. Source: ISW Russian Offensive Campaign Assessment, April 26th. The strikes are not random harassment. They are systematically targeting the infrastructure Russia needs to sustain its war effort. Oil refineries that generate export revenue, ammunition depots that supply frontline artillery, air defense systems that protect those facilities from being hit again. And in Crimea, where Russian forces have concentrated their most advanced air defense systems specifically to protect the peninsula from Ukrainian strikes, Ukraine is hitting those systems faster than Russia can replace them. On March 19th, Ukrainian forces struck the Almaz-Ante facility on Fiolent Highway in Sevastopol, where S-400 Triumph and S-300 PM-2 favorite surface-to-air missile systems are repaired. Source: RBC Ukraine. March 19, 2026, General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. That is destroying the repair infrastructure that keeps those launchers operational. And without that repair capability, every S-400 system Ukraine destroys is a permanent loss rather than a temporary disruption. The pressure on Crimea is not only military, it is economic, logistical, and psychological, and the cumulative effect of 4 years of sustained Ukrainian strikes is visible in the numbers Russia cannot hide. At least 2,839 Russian servicemen from units stationed in Crimea have been killed in action since the invasion began. Of these, 1,467 are likely Ukrainian. Citizens, residents of Crimea who were conscripted into Russian military service after the annexation. Source: Mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea, March 16, 2026. At least 125 Russian servicemen from Crimea have been confirmed as prisoners of war. Most are likely citizens of Ukraine. Those casualty figures represent the erosion of local support for occupation. When Ukrainian citizens from Crimea are killed fighting for Russia against Ukraine, the narrative of peaceful reunification becomes harder to sustain. The Yellow Ribbon Resistance movement has documented increasing dissatisfaction among residents forced to comply with occupation policies. Source: Mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea. The economic pressure is equally visible. On the night of April 25th to 26th, Ukrainian forces struck Sevastopol with at least 71 drones, one of the largest strike campaigns on the city since the invasion began. Source: Critical Threats, ISW. April 26th, Sevastopol occupation governor Mikhail Razvojayev. The strike damaged the Yamal and Filchenkov large landing ships, the Ivan Kurs reconnaissance ship, the Lukamka Black Sea Fleet Training Center, a Russian Air Defense Forces headquarters, a coastal radar station, a MiG-31 interceptor aircraft, and Belbek Airfield's maintenance section. Source: Ukraine Security Service, SBU, April 26th. 71 drones in a single night. That is the scale of production 4 years into war. And that scale, combined with 1,750-kilometer range, makes Crimea untenable as a secure Russian base. Every naval vessel, airfield, radar station, ammunition depot, and command post is exposed to strikes Russia's air defense cannot fully intercept. The Black Sea Fleet's relocation from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk is the strategic admission of that reality. Novorossiysk is on Russia's mainland coast, 350 kilometers east of Crimea, beyond the range of most Ukrainian strike systems, and protected by multiple layers of Russian air defense. Moving the fleet that reduces its operational effectiveness in the Black Sea theater, increases transit times to patrol zones, and concedes that Sevastopol, the historic headquarters of Russian naval power in the region since 1783, is no longer defensible as a primary naval base under sustained Ukrainian attack. Source: Euromaidan Press. Multiple reports on Black Sea Fleet repositioning. That repositioning is not temporary. Russia is not planning to move the fleet back to infrastructure investments Russia is making in Novorossiysk, the expanded berthing capacity, the logistics facilities, the command centers. All of it signals a permanent shift, and that shift, driven by Ukraine's expanding strike capability, is the clearest indicator that Crimea's value to Russia as a military asset has been fundamentally degraded. The question of whether Ukraine can retake Crimea militarily is separate from the question of whether Ukraine can make Crimea operationally useless to Russia. The first question requires a ground offensive that Ukraine does not currently have the force structure to execute. The second question is being answered in real time by the strike campaign Ukraine has been conducting since March 2026. On April 20th, Ukraine's GUR military intelligence claimed strikes on 2 Russian landing ships and a radar station in Sevastopol Bay. The vessels, valued at $150 million each, were successfully hit, and radar equipment was destroyed. Source: Al Jazeera. April 20th. On April 18th, Ukrainian drones struck oil storage tanks in Tuapse, Russia, for the third time in less than 2 weeks, prompting evacuations and compounding pressure on Russia's already strained oil export infrastructure. Source: the Kyiv Independent, CNN, April 18th. Those strikes are not isolated tactical wins. They are a part of a coordinated deep strike strategy that Ukraine formalized in April with the creation of a deep strike center within its unmanned systems forces. The center systematizes how Ukraine plans and executes strikes on key enemy assets, particularly in occupied territories and beyond, according to Major Olha Melishina, spokesperson for Ukraine's unmanned systems forces. Source: Euromaidan Press. April 24th, Army Inform. The Deep Strike Center's first confirmed operation was the April 22nd strike on a Russian FSB command post in occupied Donetsk, which killed 12 personnel and wounded 15 others. Source: Unmanned Systems Forces. Commander Robert Magyar Bravdy, April 23rd. That operational model, centralized planning combined with distributed execution by specialized drone units, is what allows Ukraine to sustain over 100,000 drone sorties per month and systematically degrade Russian military capacity across a theater that now extends from the front lines in Donetsk to oil refineries, 1,750 kilometers inside Russia. Source: Euromaidan Press citing Ukrainian defense officials. And the tempo is increasing. Ukrainian officials say more units and trained pilots are set to join from May, increasing the strike rate that already exceeds 100,000 sorties monthly. Source: Euromaidan Press. That scaling, combined with the expanded production of fiber optic drones, unmanned ground vehicles, and mid-strike systems, positions Ukraine to sustain and intensify the pressure on Crimea and Russian rear areas indefinitely. The financial dimension of this campaign is the element that transforms it from a military operation into an economic war of attrition. Ukraine Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov stated in April that procurement of high-quality drones and robotic platforms in the first quarter of 2026 exceeded the total for all of 2025. In March, the Russian army lost nearly 36,000 troops, with drones killing 90% of the targets. In the first quarter of 2026, Russia lost more troops than it recruited. Source: United 24. Media, April 25th, Ukraine Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov. Those casualty rates, sustained over months, are not sustainable for any military force, and the fact that 90% of Russian casualties in March were caused by drones rather than artillery or infantry combat is proof that Ukraine's investment in unmanned systems is producing asymmetric effects. Ukrainian drones cost thousands of dollars to produce. Russian soldiers cost years to train and equip. The exchange rate favors Ukraine. Russia's response has been to threaten European countries and defense industries against funding Ukraine's long-range drone production. The Russian Defense Ministry issued a warning in mid-April describing European cooperation with Ukraine on drone manufacturing as a deliberate step leading to a sharp escalation and the creeping transformation of these countries into a strategic rear for Ukraine. Russia warned of unpredictable consequences. Source: Al Jazeera. April 17th, Russian Defense Ministry statement. That warning came after Ukraine signed agreements with Norway, Germany, and other European partners to jointly produce minimum power, strike drones, and expand production capacity. The threat of unpredictable consequences is the language Russia uses when it has no effective military response. If Russia could stop Ukrainian drone production with airstrikes, it would have done so already. The fact that it is resorting to diplomatic warnings against European partners is the admission that Ukraine's drone production infrastructure is too distributed, too hardened, and too integrated with Western supply chains to be eliminated by conventional strikes. The geopolitical context in which this pressure on Crimea is intensifying matters as much as the tactical details. Putin is simultaneously managing a war in Ukraine that has cost Russia over 1 million casualties since February 2022. A collapsing relationship with Iran as the U.S.-Israel war degrades one of Russia's few remaining strategic allies, and a domestic economic crisis driven by sanctions, falling oil revenues, and inflation that is eroding public support for the war. Source: multiple analyses of Russia's strategic position, March through April 2026. Finnish President Alexander Stubb stated on April 28th that Europe may need Ukraine more than Ukraine needs Europe, noting that Ukraine now has the largest, most efficient, and most modern military in Europe. Source: Euronews, April 28th, joint press conference with Estonian President Alar Karis. That assessment from a NATO member state bordering Russia is the recognition that Ukraine's military has evolved from a force defending its own territory to a force capable of projecting power across a theater extending deep into Russian territory. And that projection capability, the 1,750-kilometer strike range, is what makes Crimea's position untenable. Ukraine does not need to invade Crimea to make it unusable. Ukraine just needs to keep hitting the air bases, the naval facilities, the ammunition depots, the radar stations, and the logistics hubs that make Crimea functional as a Russian military platform. And Ukraine is hitting those targets every week, sometimes multiple times per week, with a strike tempo that is increasing rather than decreasing as domestic production scales. Russia's air defense network in Crimea, once considered impenetrable, is being systematically dismantled. The S-400 systems that were supposed to create an air defense umbrella over the peninsula are being destroyed faster than Russia can replace them. The repair facilities that maintain those systems are being struck. The radar stations that provide early warning are being taken offline. And the cumulative effect is that Crimea is becoming more vulnerable with each passing month, not less. The Institute for the Study of War assessed that Ukrainian strikes could complicate Russia's preparations for a spring-summer offensive. Most strikes are focused on Russian forces in eastern and southern Ukraine, precisely where the Russian army has concentrated its main offensive actions in recent weeks. Source: ISW analysis cited by RBC Ukraine March 19th. That assessment is the strategic context. Ukraine is not just defending. Ukraine is degrading Russia's offensive capability by striking the logistics and command infrastructure that makes large-scale operations possible. And Crimea, as the primary logistics hub for Russian operations in southern Ukraine, is the highest value target in that campaign. Every ammunition depot Ukraine destroys in Crimea is ammunition that does not reach Russian artillery on the Zaporizhzhia or Kherson fronts. Every fuel depot that burns is fuel that does not power Russian tanks. Every radar station that goes offline is early warning that Russian air defenses no longer have. The pressure is cumulative. And it is working. Here is every verified fact used in this script with its source. Ukraine Defense Ministry announced on April 28, 2026, that Ukrainian forces have more than doubled their deep strike range from 630 kilometers in February 2022 to 1,750 kilometers currently. Source: Ukraine Defense Ministry official statement, Ukrinform, April 28. Ukrainian forces struck the Ukhta oil refinery in Russia's Komi Republic in February 2026, located approximately 1,750 kilometers from the state border. Source: Ukrinform, April 28, citing Defense Ministry. On March 13th, Ukraine's Magyar's Birds unit struck a Russian Nebo 55 ZH-6 radar station in Crimea. On March 14th, Ukrainian forces destroyed Iskander missile launchers near Vishniva and Kurortny. On March 15th, an S-400 Triumph air defense system and radar stations were hit. Source: Mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, March 16. Most of Russia's Black Sea Fleet has relocated from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk due to Ukrainian strikes. Source: Euromaidan Press, April 26. On April 25th to 26, Ukrainian forces struck Sevastopol with at least 71 drones, hitting the Yamal and Filchenkov landing ships, Ivan Kurs reconnaissance ship, radar stations, a MiG-31 aircraft, and Belbek airfield. Source: Ukraine Security Service SBU, Critical Threats, ISW, April 26, Sevastopol Governor, Razvozhayev. Western-supplied ATACMS missiles have ranges of approximately 165 kilometers for cluster variants and up to 300 kilometers for unitary warhead models. Source: Army Recognition. December 10/20/25. On March 19th, Ukrainian forces struck the Almazante repair facility in Sevastopol, where S-400 and S-300 systems are serviced. Source: RBC Ukraine. March 19, General Staff Armed Forces of Ukraine. At least 2,839 Russian servicemen from Crimea-based units were killed in action. 1,467 likely Ukrainian citizens. At least 125 confirmed prisoners of war. Source: Mission of President of Ukraine in Crimea, March 16. Ukraine created a deep strike center in April 2026 to coordinate attacks on high-priority targets. First operation hit the Russian FSB command post in Donetsk on April 22, killing 12 and wounding 15. Source: Euromaidan Press, April 24, Army Inform, Commander Robert Magyar Brovdy. Ukraine conducts over 100,000 drone sorties per month. Source: Euromaidan Press, citing Ukrainian defense officials. Ukraine Defense Minister Fedorov stated that in March 2026, Russian army lost nearly 36,000 troops, with drones killing 90% of targets. In first quarter 2026, Russia lost more troops than it recruited. Source: United 24, Media, April 25. Finnish President Alexander Stubb stated on April 28 that Ukraine has the largest, most efficient, and most modern military in Europe. Source: Euronews. April 28, Russian Defense Ministry warned European countries in mid-April against funding Ukraine's drone production, calling it a sharp escalation. Source: Al Jazeera. April 17. Ukrainian forces struck Russian oil storage in Tuapse for third time in less than 2 weeks on April 18th. Source: The Kyiv Independent, CNN, April 18. Ukraine's strike capability is not a future threat. It is a present reality that is systematically dismantling Russia's ability to use Crimea as a military base. The 1,750-kilometer range gives Ukraine the reach to hit targets from the peninsula to the Arctic. The over 100,000 monthly drone sorties give Ukraine the volume to sustain that pressure indefinitely. And the Deep Strike Center gives Ukraine the coordination to make every strike count toward the strategic objective of degrading Russian military capacity. Crimea is under pressure, not from a ground invasion Ukraine does not have the force structure to execute, but from a drone campaign that is making the peninsula operationally unusable to Russia at a pace faster than Russia can rebuild what Ukraine destroys. And that pressure, combined with Russia's simultaneous commitments in Ukraine, economic strain, and eroding global position, is forcing Putin into a calculation he has avoided since 2014. Can Russia hold territory it cannot defend? Can it sustain casualties it cannot replace? Can it project power from bases that are under constant attack? The data from March and April 2026 says no, and the trajectory of Ukraine's expanding strike capability, the increasing tempo of operations, and the systematic targeting of Crimea's military infrastructure says the pressure will continue to intensify. Do you think Russia can hold Crimea indefinitely under this level of sustained Ukrainian strikes, or will Putin eventually face a decision between withdrawing forces or watching the peninsula become a military liability? Every source in this script is named and verifiable. If this gave you the full picture of how Ukraine's deep strike capability is transforming the strategic situation in Crimea, subscribe.